They stepped into the camp expecting control, expecting strict orders, and expecting every movement to be watched. But what they saw instead did not match anything they had prepared for. Because the space was calm, the guards did not react, and the routine they expected never began, forcing them to slow down as they entered, not because they were stopped, but because nothing around them behaved the way it should have. And the more they looked around, the less it made sense. The group moved through the entrance of the camp in a steady line, stepping forward at a controlled pace as they followed the path ahead, while the open yard came into view without the immediate pressure they had expected. One prisoner near the front slowed slightly as he crossed the threshold, adjusting his step as if anticipating a command, then continuing forward when none was given. Another man stepped in behind him, placing his foot down carefully before straightening his posture and scanning the space ahead without stopping. A third prisoner turned his head briefly toward a guard position near the entrance, holding the look for a moment before facing forward again as the guard did not react. One man at the center shifted his stance as he walked, adjusting his position to maintain spacing, then continued forward without changing pace. Another prisoner moved closer to the edge of the path, stepping slightly outward to get a clearer view of the yard before returning to alignment with the group. A man near the back stepped forward with a longer stride, then shortened his next step to match the movement ahead as the group continued deeper inside. One prisoner slowed again as he passed a structure on the side, turning his head briefly toward it before facing forward and continuing. Another man adjusted his posture, standing more upright than before as he moved into the open space, scanning the yard without stopping. A third prisoner stepped forward and then slightly to the side, repositioning himself within the group before continuing straight again. One man near the front took 2 steady steps without interruption, then reduced his pace slightly as he entered the center of the yard. Another prisoner turned his head again toward the guards, holding the look longer this time before returning his gaze forward as nothing changed. The group continued moving, but the rhythm had already shifted, no longer driven by commands, but by individual adjustments made by each man as they reacted to the space. And as they advanced further into the camp, the first shift took place because the environment around them did not enforce control, and that absence began to change the way they moved. As the group continued deeper into the yard, several prisoners began to slow their movement, not stopping completely, but reducing their pace as they tried to follow multiple details at once. One prisoner near the front turned his head toward a row of structures, tracking the line of buildings as he walked, then facing forward again without breaking his step. Another man shifted slightly to the side, stepping closer to the edge of the path to gain a clearer view, then returning to his original position as the group advanced. A third prisoner lowered his gaze briefly toward the ground, then lifted it again, scanning the space ahead before taking another step forward. One man at the center adjusted his direction slightly, stepping a few inches offline before correcting himself and continuing straight. Another prisoner passed close to a guard, keeping his pace steady while turning his head for a brief moment, then facing forward again when the guard did not respond. A man near the back slowed more noticeably, allowing a small gap to form in front of him, then stepped forward again to close it. One prisoner leaned slightly as he walked, angling his body to maintain a view of a structure to his right, then straightened again as he moved past it. Another man stepped forward more quickly for 2 steps, then reduced his pace to match the movement ahead once more. A third prisoner turned his head longer than the others, tracking a distant point in the yard before returning his attention forward. One man adjusted his posture again, standing more upright as he entered a more open section of the yard, then continued without stopping. Another prisoner stepped slightly closer to the center of the group, reducing the distance between himself and the men ahead. The movement continued, but it was no longer uniform, as each prisoner reacted differently to what he was seeing, creating small variations in pace and direction. And as the group moved further without interruption, The second shift took place because the lack of immediate control allowed observation to replace reaction, changing how they advanced through the space. As the group continued forward, the movement began to lose its early consistency, not because they stopped, but because each prisoner started adjusting his path more independently. One prisoner near the front reduced his pace noticeably, taking a shorter step and allowing the distance ahead of him to increase before stepping forward again. Another man stepped slightly off the path, moving a few inches to the left, then holding that position for several steps instead of correcting immediately. A third prisoner walked past a marked point in the yard, then slowed and turned his head briefly as if checking whether he had crossed a boundary. One man at the center took 2 steps forward, then stopped completely, forcing the prisoner behind him to move around instead of waiting. Another prisoner changed direction mid-step, placing his foot at an angle, then continuing in a slightly different line before stopping. A man near the back advanced further than before, taking 3 continuous steps without slowing, then halting as the space around him opened up. One prisoner approached closer to a guard than expected, reducing the distance between them, then stopping as the guard remained still. Another man turned his head toward the guard and held the look longer than before, then faced forward again and took a single step away. A third prisoner stepped across the path of another, forcing a brief adjustment as both men shifted their direction to avoid contact. One man moved toward the edge of the yard, taking a longer step than the others, then stopping just short of the boundary. Another prisoner who had been standing still resumed movement, stepping forward once, then stopping again after closing a small gap. The pattern of movement became uneven, no longer a line or a group, but a scattered set of actions happening at different speeds and in different directions. And as more prisoners began to move without clear alignment or shared rhythm, the third shift took place because the structure they expected to follow no longer existed, and doubt began to shape every step they took. As the prisoners spread further across the yard, several of them began to look directly toward the guards, expecting a correction, but the guards remained in place without stepping forward. One prisoner near the center stopped and turned his head fully toward a guard, holding the look for a moment before facing forward again when nothing changed. Another man slowed his movement while approaching the edge of the yard, then continued walking when no signal was given to stop him. A third prisoner stepped closer to a guard than before, reducing the distance between them with a deliberate step, then stopping as the guard did not react. One man at the front changed direction mid-step, turning slightly toward a guard, then continuing forward once it became clear no response would follow. Another prisoner walked parallel to a guard for several steps, maintaining a close distance, then slowed and stopped without being addressed. A man near the back stepped forward more quickly than the others, crossing through a gap and moving toward open space before halting. One prisoner stood still while others moved around him, then stepped forward again once the path ahead cleared. Another man approached the boundary line, taking a longer step forward, then stopping just before reaching the edge as no one intervened. A third prisoner turned his head repeatedly between 2 guards, checking both directions before taking another step forward. One man shifted his stance near the center, stepping slightly outward and then correcting back into a new position closer to others. Another prisoner moved past a guard at a closer distance than expected, continuing without slowing, then stopping further ahead. The guards remained silent, no movement, no commands, and no attempt to restore any kind of formation. And as the lack of response continued, the fourth shift took place. Because the absence of reaction no longer created hesitation, it began to change how far each man was willing to go. As the silence from the guards continued without interruption, several prisoners began to extend their movement beyond the earlier limits, taking longer steps and covering more ground across the yard. One prisoner near the edge stepped forward with a longer stride, placing his foot closer to the boundary than before, then pausing briefly before taking another step in the same direction. Another man shifted his path completely, walking diagonally across the yard instead of following any visible line, then slowing as he reached open space. A third prisoner moved toward a structure at the far side, taking steady steps until he reached its edge, then stopping and turning slightly to look back across the yard. One man at the center increased his pace for several steps, closing the distance with a small group ahead, then stopping once he reached them without continuing further. Another prisoner stepped past a point where others had stopped earlier, moving further into the open area before halting and holding his position. A man near the back crossed through the center of the yard, walking between two scattered groups before stopping in a new position. One prisoner approached the boundary line more directly, taking 2 steps forward and then a third, then stopping just short of the edge without being stopped. Another man changed direction again, stepping away from the boundary and moving back toward the center, then slowing as he rejoined the flow of movement. A third prisoner walked further than before, taking several uninterrupted steps until he became one of the furthest men from the original formation, then paused. One man near the center stepped forward again after stopping, continuing for another short distance before halting once more. Another prisoner tested the space between himself and a guard, walking closer than anyone else had, then stopping when the distance became minimal. The yard now held multiple paths, different directions, and varied distances, with no single pattern guiding the movement anymore. And as more prisoners continued to push their movement further without being stopped, the fifth shift took place, because hesitation had turned into controlled expansion and the limits they expected no longer appeared to exist. As the movement across the yard continued to expand, the pace began to settle gradually, not stopping, but becoming more consistent as repeated actions replaced earlier hesitation. One prisoner who had reached the boundary turned back toward the center, taking 2 steady steps before slowing and stopping among a small group. Another man who had been standing still for several seconds stepped forward again, continuing in a straight line before reducing his pace and holding his position. A third prisoner shifted from the center toward a different direction, walking with more control than before, then stopping at a new point without looking toward the guards. One man near the edge stepped back from the boundary, increasing the distance between himself and the limit he had approached, then aligning himself with others nearby. Another prisoner crossed the yard from one side to the other, moving between scattered groups before stopping at a position that remained stable. A man at the center took several controlled steps forward, then slowed and maintained his place without adjusting again. One prisoner who had been moving unpredictably earlier now walked in a straight line, stopping once and then remaining still without repeating the movement. Another man adjusted his position slightly, stepping closer to others, reducing the gaps that had formed earlier across the yard. A third prisoner stepped away from a group, then returned again, repositioning himself before becoming still. One man near the back moved forward steadily, closing the distance with the others, then stopping as the spacing became more even. Another prisoner turned his body slightly while walking, then straightened and held his new position without further movement. The scattered motion began to organize itself into a slower, more stable pattern, not imposed by orders, but formed through repeated individual adjustments. And as the yard shifted from uncertainty into a controlled rhythm, the final shift took place. Because the absence of command had not created disorder, it had produced a different kind of order that none of them had expected. They had expected control to define every movement, clear boundaries to guide each step, and immediate consequences to follow even the smallest change in direction. But as the moment unfolded and nothing stopped them, nothing corrected them, and nothing forced them back into place, their movement changed in a way they had not prepared for, because the absence of control did not create freedom in the way they imagined. It created hesitation that shaped every action and turned each step into a decision that no one wanted to take first. As the yard settled into a slower rhythm, with men adjusting their positions without urgency and holding their place without instruction. The space itself remained unchanged, yet the way they moved within it had already transformed completely, driven not by orders, but by the uncertainty of what would happen if they continued or if they stopped. And as the moment reached its end, with no signal to restore formation and no command to reset their movement, the realization remained visible through their actions alone, because the freedom they had been given was not something they could immediately use, and the silence that replaced control had already changed the way they responded to every step that followed. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.